Did you know that Henry Ford supported Hitler's anti-Semitic views, or that Henry Ford personally, as well as Ford Motor Company, actually funded Hitler and the Nazi Party? Yeah, the founder of one of America's most iconic and patriotic companies endorsed one of history's most infamous dictators. And if you thought General Motors and their history with Hitler was shocking, boy do I have a video for you. Because while General Motors was actually trying to distance themselves from the Nazi regime, but were unwilling to part with their German subsidiary Opel, Ford was desperate to appease the Nazi government. Want to know what else they did on top of that? Well, you're in the right place. Hello people of the internet, I'm Nico, and I once did a school project on Henry Ford in the 2nd grade, but for some reason didn't know about this dark side of Ford's history. I guess it wasn't taught in school. So, in this sequel to my video on General Motors, I teach you the side of Ford's history that I didn't know of when I did my elementary school project. Just as in part 1, I need to give you a little context for the time period and for Germany specifically, but this time I'll try it in less than 30 seconds. So, at the end of the 1920s, there was a depression that we can all agree was pretty great. Everyone's finances were in the outhouse, and as the depression came to an end, everyone was looking for all the possible ways to make money, including Ford. In Germany, Hitler and the Nazi Party had managed to stabilize the economy using some massive military spending, such as building the German Autobahn, which gained them a lot of support. Hitler at the time was seen as a patriotic hero who was fixing up the country, and with this rejuvenation of the fatherland, Ford and GM decided to jump in on the action. General Motors jumped in by purchasing Opel in 1929, and if you want to know more about the history of Hitler and GM, then you'll have to watch my previous video. Ford, on the other hand, just had a German them, Ford Werke. Now, how Ford and General Motors got their brand set up in Germany isn't really that important. However, what they did with the brands and how they operated those brands very much matters. Ford Werke, which from here on I'll just call Ford, was desperate to appease Hitler and the Nazi government, because while GM subsidiary Opel had roughly 40% market share, that's 40, Ford was struggling to do any kind of business. And quickly, to give an idea of just how outrageous that market share is, here in the US, GM currently has a market share of just under 18%. Why Opel was doing so well can be debated, but I think it's just down to patriotism. Opel was an iconic German company from the 1860s, and it was a powerhouse of the automotive industry. It was a brand the Germans could be proud of, much like how Ford and GM are here in the US. But in Germany, Ford was the outsider company from America, the nation that had wrecked Germany's reputation following World War I, so obviously the brand was not going to be that well received. This was proved in that Ford was denied certification as a national producer. What is this certification, you ask? Quite simply, it was a nationally recognized certification needed to receive government contracts, which back in the day was the best way to be guaranteed sales and therefore profit. So for Ford to not get the certification was a major blow to their hopes of economic salvation in Germany. And this left them with one option: to become the biggest suck-up of the century. For starters, the management of Ford came up with new criteria for hiring management staff, which means, you guessed it, no Jews and no foreigners either. Interestingly, despite his anti-Semitic beliefs, Henry Ford was against these attempts to exclude Jews and foreigners, but when control of German Ford moved from Berlin to Cologne, he was unable to reverse the tide. Why he was unable to likely has to do with another step German Ford took to appease the German people, as well as the Nazi regime, in which they partnered with the German firm IG Farben, who partially funded the construction of Ford's factory in Cologne. The second attempt Ford made to appease the Reich was by importing as much scarce raw material as possible. Now, it was partially to relieve their own shortages, since the Nazi government limited their access to those materials, but it was also kind of a pleading gesture, like a desperate guy trying to get a girl who's way out of his league and clearly wants nothing to do with him. But unlike me, Ford did not give up, because if you've been counting along, that was only 2 attempts, and the rules of baseball clearly state that it's 3 strikes before you're out. So the final chance went as follows. The Nazi government was in desperate need of foreign currency so that it could buy more raw materials, obviously needed for Hitler's rearmament program. So Ford took this opportunity to negotiate with American Ford and English Ford in order to maximize its own exports, which would then bring in more foreign currency. And would you know, it did not work. Not at first, anyway. The Reich then made their own changes to make Ford more appealing, in which they replaced some of the managerial staff with their own preferred supporters, most notably Robert Schmidt. I say notably, but honestly I don't know much about him, and all you need to know is that he was appointed by the Reich to run Ford just a little while before Ford started using slave labor. Yeah, both Ford and General Motors use slave labor, but I'll get to that in a sec. One thing that did kind of work for Ford was some much needed rebranding. About a minute and 20 seconds ago, I mentioned Ford's partnership with IG Farben, which was mostly a money thing, but it also came with an added side bonus. IG Farben was a German chemical company, and obviously had a much better reputation than the outsider that is Ford. So with Ford in close association with a well-established German firm, and with some shifting of the car lineup to be more German, Ford started to turn the brand around. These changes helped put Ford more in favor with the Nazi regime, and eventually they, like General Motors, started to build military vehicles. Now, Ford was still not the favorite child, but they were slowly gaining more respect, and in the years leading up to the war, both Ford of Germany and Ford of America started to work closely with the Nazi government. There were certain deals made between German and American Ford in the exchange of parts and raw materials, in which the parts would be sent to America and the raw materials would be sent to Germany. There was another deal made between German and American Ford, where American Ford would send partially assembled trucks to Germany to be assembled in the Cologne factory. Ford of Germany also sent vehicles to the US in exchange for licenses to purchase rubber from other Ford subsidiaries. The rubber then went to German tire manufacturers, and 30% of those tires made then went to the Nazi government. And speaking of rubber, Ford's German business partner, IG Farben, had a synthetic rubber factory right next to the Auschwitz concentration camp. They also had forced labor like Ford and GM, and in this factory alone, 23,000 forced laborers died from 1943 to 1945. And if that wasn't bad enough, IG Farben was also the main manufacturer of Zyklon B, and if you don't know what Zyklon B is, that is the very chemical used in all the gas chambers of the concentration camps, and most famously at Auschwitz. To be clear, this is very much not an issue of Ford. Sure, they partnered with the company, but otherwise they were still two very separate entities. And aside from Ford's direct funding of Hitler and the Nazi Party early on, they were not particularly immoral during this time period. Don't get me wrong, Ford was no angel child by any means. I mean, sending American-built trucks to Germany to be assembled there is not a good look. Adopting Nazi ideologies in the workplace is arguably even worse, and using forced labor is certainly worse. But unlike General Motors, Ford did not make any massive profits from using forced labor. That's even with their rebranding, all the car models made specifically to appeal to the German people, and all the deals Ford made with other Ford subsidiaries to bring raw materials to Germany. Now, Ford did make some modest profits in the first few years of the war, but those were wiped clean in the following years, mostly because the Nazi government stopped giving compensation for war damages to any companies whose majority ownership was of an enemy country. The US did give some compensation after the war, but Ford only received about $1 million in compensation, whereas General Motors received $33 million. Also, note on the forced labor, that was completely non-negotiable. So Ford and General Motors did use forced labor, but it was not up to them, that was forced upon them. All of this shows that while Ford was involved with the Nazi regime, it was less an act of immorality than it was an act of desperation to stay in business. This does not excuse their actions, but I would say that Ford is more in the green than General Motors, especially since Ford, despite not having gained much from having used forced labor, has donated some $21 million to support causes to help those who were exploited during the war. Meanwhile, I was not able to find anything about General Motors doing the same. There is more to the story, both for General Motors and for Ford, but some people like Professor Simon Reich, whose writings I used as sources in the making of this video, have already devoted their whole lives to studying this, and I have more interest than just World War II. If you want to know more about this topic, then I'll link you to some books I have listed in the description below. I specifically recommend Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. This was definitely a good read and a very crucial source in making this video. I'll also link my previous video at the end of this video. Now, this video and my previous video are not for you to set out and shame General Motors and Ford for their actions some 70 years ago. Instead, I think both videos do a good job of showing that 1. The history we are taught in school is never fully comprehensive, and 2. That a company's main interest is to make money off of a product they provide, and that morals are more a question of how they affect the reputation of the company. To summarize the story, Ford directly financed the perpetrator of Earth's most infamous and destructive conflict, and also worked with an enemy power out of desperation to stay in business. But Ford also couldn't turn down the forced labor that it used, and they have done some good to make up for it by donating to some helpful causes. I don't think that we should necessarily celebrate Henry Ford himself, though I definitely think we can thank him for the good that he has done in terms of the automotive industry, and we can also learn from his failings. Be sure to stay tuned for my next video on insurance companies that won't pay out anymore thanks to some TikTok users. If you haven't watched my previous video on General Motors and their history with Hitler, then be sure to check that out. Until next time, people of the internet, peace out.